So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much all for attending this panel on framing an equity-minded approach to SoTL through the arts and humanities. If we could go to the next slide, please. I just want to give you all some context for where this panel is coming from. The Arts and Humanities Interest Group has long explored the position of arts and humanities disciplines in SoTL and in ISSOTL as an organization, and of course of SoTL in the arts and humanities. As an IG, we strive to make SoTL and ISSOTL more inviting for arts and humanities teachers, scholars who come with habits of mind, ways of knowing, and approaches to research that differ from what have been historically more broadly accepted approaches to much of SoTL work. So this panel is an extension of this conversation, which has been ongoing since 2008. Some prominent landmarks along the way include the publication of a special arts and humanities section in Teaching and Learning Inquiry in 2016, and the interest group meeting at ISSOTL21 in Bergen, Norway. It was at this interest group meeting where members compiled a list of characteristics and choices of SoTL from the arts and humanities in a collective act of valuing these habits of mind and approaches to research. The intention was to elucidate these characteristics and choices for the broader ISSOTL membership and to continue the work of advocating for epistemological and methodological pluralism under the big tent of SoTL. So this year's conference, and especially the thread on justice and equity in and through SoTL, provided an opportunity for us to do that in a way that was grounded in ISSOTL's ongoing mission to be more inclusive and more equitable. So on to the next slide, we'll provide some further context around how we seek to frame an equity-minded approach to SoTL through the arts and humanities. By taking a moment to define how we've come to approach equity in education. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development provides a simple definition of equity in education where we can begin this definitional work. They share that institutions work to ensure that personal or social circumstances such as gender, socioeconomic status, migrant background, age, special needs, or place of residence do not hinder the achievement of one's educational potential, i.e. fairness, and that all individuals reach at least a minimum level of skills, i.e. inclusion. So educational equity is the responsibility of all institutional stakeholders, and yet practitioners can play a key part through equity-mindedness. So to this end, we also draw on the Center for Urban Education and their definition of equity-mindedness as calling attention to patterns of inequity in student outcomes. These practitioners are willing to take personal and institutional responsibility for the success of their students and critically reassess their own practices. So ultimately, cultivating practitioner equity-mindedness is a tangible way of working toward ISSOTL's commitment to focusing our diversity efforts explicitly on issues of inclusion for members of equity-seeking groups, this drawn from the ISSOTL strategic plan. All right, so let's get into it. The panel will now introduce ourselves, and we'll provide some insight into how we're approaching equity through our arts and humanities disciplinary contexts. I'll go first. My name is Angela Zito. And I am an academic staff member with the Writing Center and the Writing Across the Curriculum programs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States. I have an interdisciplinary background in literary studies, writing studies, and composition rhetoric. In my position, I teach professional development seminars for graduate instructors in the Writing Center and for new faculty learning about writing across the curriculum. In both these contexts, we regularly pursue conversation about the inequities that are tied up in notions of quote unquote good writing. So that's anywhere from the expectation for near perfect execution of so-called standard academic English to presumed awareness of implicit genre conventions and to the inescapable subjectivity of evaluating student writing. So through these conversations, we confront the questions, How does writing as a vehicle for constructing and communicating knowledge in academic spaces further entrench or disrupt systems of oppression? And I'll pass it off to our next panelist, Nancy.
Hi, can y'all hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, thank you. It's storming here, and I'm having some on-screen issues with the platform, so I'm not going to turn my camera on right now. Pardon me for being a disembodied voice. So I'm Nancy Chick. I'm at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida in the US, which is near Orlando. To situate it more clearly, I'm about 10 miles from Disney World. I'm the Director of Faculty Development on this campus and past president with Ching Huang-hoon of the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And I'm going to provide some insight into my discipline, which is literary studies, just by reviewing a relevant challenge in the field that I'm then going to pull forward a little later as we start talking about SoTL and equity in SoTL. And this issue is the literary canon and representation specifically. So just in case you're not familiar, the literary canon is basically the literary works that we consider worth reading, studying, and remembering. It's not that one or two people sit down and create this list. It's the collective work of the field, often without reflecting on who is represented in the canon, who is not represented in the canon, and what it means to be left out of the canon. So these are kind of key questions that we've been talking about in the discipline since the 1960s or so. And as teachers of literary studies, we have to think about what's the experience of reading the canon, but not seeing yourself represented in it. Less talked about, but important to think about, is what's the experience of reading the canon and of seeing only yourself represented in it. And then also, as teachers, central to this issue is what texts then do we assign, why, and what are the consequences? So this is the thread of my discipline that I'm going to pick up and carry through later. And I will pass it to our next panelist. Oh, and I also want to say thank you to Angela for bringing us all together and coordinating this whole discussion. Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Guberman. I work at Purdue University, which is in Indiana in the US. It's a large public STEM-centric research institution, and my position is currently split between our teaching center and our diversity and inclusion unit. And I'll also say I greatly appreciate Angela's efforts to put this together and push us to think about these issues, both for ourselves and as they connect across. My background is in music history, so a lot of what I'll be talking about is really about the class I've been teaching for the past 4 years at Purdue and for another 5+ years at previous institutions, which is on the history of rock music, which has a lot of the same challenges Nancy mentioned about what we include and who is what represented, especially just what the term rock even means. But I actually want to shift focus here to talk about who the students are as they enter my class, because this is a class for non-music majors, and there's no prereq, there's no postreq. It sort of stands alone as its own course at our institution. And one thing about music education in the United States is that it is incredibly inequitable at the K-12 level in terms of what schools even have music programs, but also then within schools that have music programs, who is encouraged to participate in those programs and who is given the options and flexibility, especially as these programs are often costly if you need to get instruments or require access or transportation before or after school time. So who has the ability to gain musical education before they come? And then when they're in my class, how do I encourage students to bring the knowledge and skills to the forefront while also not alienating their peers? One of the easiest ways to piss off musicologists is to say that music is a universal language, but well, that's not true. It is a language, and there's specific language associated with it. And when some students are fluent in those terms, it can really alienate and make other students feel like they don't belong in the classroom, which is absolutely not the case. So then the question I always ask myself is, what does it look like to simultaneously challenge all students in this class? And just very quickly, I'll say in the past year, I've had a student who was active as a music producer, sort of creating records and had music available on Spotify. And I now have a student who told me they're taking the class because they don't really listen to music right now, but all their friends do, and they're hoping that my class will help them understand how to get into and be interested in music. So I really run the full gamut, and I want to make sure that all of those students are having a challenging and valuable experience. So I will now pass it on to John.
Hi everyone, my name is John Vinmaren. I come to the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning from the field of religious studies. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Ruprecht Karls Universität Heidelberg in Deutschland. It's late here right now, where my disciplinary focus is the texts which are now contained in the New Testament. Okay. In a way pretty similar to Dan's discipline of music, students enter the religious studies classroom with a really wide range of content knowledge. Okay. Some come with very specific and sometimes deeply personal understandings of specific traditions, and some have simply never encountered these texts or some of these traditions before. Okay. So really two issues. One is vastly different prior knowledge, and then some very personal interpretations as well. Okay. I seek to use SoTL to equitably accommodate this wide range of student backgrounds and to prompt students, no matter where they're coming from, to new ways of thinking about the religious traditions and texts that are in our classrooms. So, and then I will pass it on to, I think, Angela.
Yes. Thanks, John, Dan, and Nancy. We'll go around the table once again, so to speak, around the table to share and explain some characteristics of SoTL in the arts and humanities and how we believe they can work to promote equity in SoTL. But first, I want to introduce briefly some of these characteristics. If we could go to the next slide. So again, these characteristics were generated through the Arts and Humanities IG meeting at ISSOTL21 in Bergen. And you can access the actual document with these characteristics listed on it on the Arts and Humanities IG website. You can see the URL listed at the bottom of this slide. But rather than walk through each of these characteristics one by one, we're each going to talk about them in a cluster, so with a total of 4 clusters. Many of these characteristics are interrelated, and so it really seemed that clustering them together was more intuitive than artificially separating them out one by one. And I'm saying, I don't know if my camera is working, but so long as the microphone is working, I think we're good. Okay, so I'll begin. If we could go to the next slide. I'll begin with the first cluster. Again, I'm coming at this project most directly from writing studies and from composition. And I felt particularly drawn to this cluster of characteristics that are listed on this slide. They include using methods such as narrative inquiry, close reading, thought experiments, and meditations, as well as storytelling and meaningful reflection, and the use of artifacts of student thinking, learning, and expression. So writing studies is a methodologically diverse field, but narrative inquiry and storytelling and reflection, these are all really prominent means of constructing new knowledge and for communicating that knowledge within writing studies. Hence my attraction to this particular cluster. Composition research that's grounded in these methods is often shaped by social constructivist epistemologies and abductive reasoning, which I think Dan's going to talk about in a little bit about what on earth that means. But these kinds of approaches not only allow, but actually anticipate complex subjectivities in study design, in data collection, and in analysis as well. And in their final written form, some of these studies might also foreground those complex subjectivities through forms such as descriptive vignettes or autobiographical reflection, and that could be on the part of the authors or of the participants or both. Reflection is a particularly high-value practice in writing studies, both as an artifact of student learning and as a source of research data. In the US, writing instructors in higher education frequently use reflective writing as a means of observing and evaluating student learning. So, for example, by having students submit a cover memo for portfolio submissions where students are expected to engage in some metacognitive reflection on the writing assignments that they have included in the portfolio. Such student-composed reflections can also be used as research data. For example, in the Meaningful Writing Project, a book published in 2016, authors Michelle Udici, Anna Lynn Geller, and Neil Lerner sought to learn what made writing assignments meaningful to students, and they did that by asking open-ended questions that prompted reflection on the part of student respondents. And then students' reflections then guided the researchers' analysis via grounded theory, rather than being subject to having some external theoretical framework mapped onto those reflections. What's more, in this particular book, the authors engage in some reflective storytelling of their own in the form of their writing when they present their research methods within the book's introduction. So if you bear with me for like a brief quotation, they actually write, rather than marginalize the description of our methods to an appendix, we offer the full story here to emphasize that in qualitative research of this sort, dispositions of researchers, questions asked, methods of data collection and analysis, and the writing up of that research are intertwined in what Wendy Bishop describes as author-saturated texts, or those that acknowledge their constructedness. What we offer next are the stories of that constructedness. So emphasis on stories and that collective reflection there. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So really thinking about how this connects with the idea of equity in SoTL, we need to think about whose subjectivities shape the research in writing studies and elsewhere. And this matters immensely for whether systems of oppression are further entrenched or deconstructed in teaching and learning environments and in SoTL. Narrative and reflection as a research method, as well as a writing form, can work to elucidate and amplify ways of knowing and being that are otherwise colonized or whitewashed by academic norms. An example of this is what composition rhetoric scholar Asia Martinez calls counterstory, which is a research methodology grounded in critical race theory. Counterstory is a means by which marginalized scholars and students can contribute to conversations about dominant ideologies and also refuse the stories that dominant ideologies tell about them. Counterstory as a research method can take shape in multiple different genres as well, getting at this idea of both method and form of writing. Asia Martinez identifies narrative dialogue, fantasy, allegory, and autobiographical reflection as some of these key genres. Valuing stories, reflection, and other forms of narrative as legitimate research methods will promote equity in SoTL by recognizing more ways of knowing than have been traditionally embraced by the colonial, Western, and white academic standards that historically have shaped the work. I am, of course, not the first to suggest this. Alison Cook-Sather, Sophia Abbott, and Peter Felton have argued something similar in a recent article in Teaching and Learning Inquiry about legitimizing reflective writing in SoTL. But I really want to emphasize that methodologies like reflection and counterstory have been used in the scholarship of teaching and learning, but they certainly haven't been widely valued and legitimated to the degree where systems of exclusion and colonization might begin to be undone. Some examples of counterstory in SoTL and ISSOTL include Yeknaw's opinion piece in the International Journal for Students as Partners, as well as Kasturi Bahari Leek's Teaching and Learning Inquiry article toward a borderless, decolonized, socially just, and inclusive scholarship of teaching and learning, which was adapted from her keynote address at the 2019 ISSOTL conference. So, and just to elaborate on one of these examples, in her piece, Yeknaw narrates her experience as an Indigenous student representative on the ISSOTL board, asking the following question along the way. She writes, how does the taken for granted dominance of colonial ways of knowing and being in the ISSOTL community that determine what counts as SoTL and how learners and teachers form relationships create space for Indigenous people, either students or faculty, to be partners in learning and teaching? Kasturi Bahari Leek likewise really emphasizes narratives of the self, reflection, and story in her piece. But I'll leave off here with just a reminder that student writing too, as a measure of learning and as a source of research data, has significant implications for how we pursue equity through SoTL. So again, I'll pass things off to Nancy.
Okay. Just a kind of transitional comment and to bring us back to the big picture and why we're talking about it this way. We have in the room with us, hi Mary Huber, just to remind us all of the notion from Huber and Hutchings, the notion of SoTL as a teaching commons. This idea that we may start with our disciplines, we carry our disciplines with us into SoTL spaces and look to those disciplines for, hi Mary, for what concepts, what skills, what theories, etc. we can bring to deepen, enhance, evolve, trouble SoTL. And so that's in part what we're doing here, is each of us is looking at our discipline for what we might bring to SoTL to help advance this notion of equity within SoTL. So that's just a little framing idea. And then again, just to remind of something that Angela said, the clusters that the four of us formed are overlapping and spilling over onto each other. So you'll see that a lot of what we're talking about is really woven together in ways that these kind of four neat slides don't capture. So just to foreground that. The cluster that I chose from the characteristics of SoTL in the arts and humanities, that work that the interest group did in Bergen together, I'm really interested in the three here on the screen, starting with that those of us in the arts and humanities, we yearn for and produce and value SoTL that is rich with quotes and other voices. I'll just point back to Angela just a couple of minutes ago, pointed out that she was reading a full quote. So rather than paraphrasing or summarizing or choosing just a small bit of it, she demonstrated how she values the voice and the full thought by, and I can't remember who it was she was quoting, but how she illustrated that bringing in full quotes, the voices of others, the scholars, the texts. This is something in literary studies and in other fields within the arts and humanities that's ubiquitous. If you even think about, all of you in the room, if you think about when you look at your students' writing, if they took an English composition or first-year writing class, they probably learned that they should be infusing quotes as pieces of evidence from the texts that they're writing about. And then those students may go to other classes some of which, and write in other classes, some of which prefer fewer quotes and primarily focusing on the voice, the writing, the words of the student. And then when we do PowerPoint presentations, you'll often see that we include a lot of text. We include full quotes from the texts and the authors that we refer to. That's something we value. So just putting that out there as a key characteristic of the arts and humanities and of SoTL in the arts and humanities. Related to this is that we are intentional about the citation styles that we choose. We tend to use citation styles that foreground the bibliographic information that we value. For instance, we value naming authors and using their full names to represent their full humanity, their full identity, to avoid, in essence, erasing part of their name. This is something that's central to our citation styles. Also, we're not as concerned about publication date. So in the citation styles that we use, for instance, MLA, Chicago even, we tend to put the citation date later in the actual citation rather than right after the author's name, because we're less concerned with using only the most recent or valuing the most recent publications. We like to go back all the way to the beginning. So foregrounding that citation date isn't as important to us, or sorry, that publication date isn't as important to us. So we're very intentional about our citation styles, and we can get a little ornery about which citation styles we have to use when we publish. For these reasons, they're very meaningful, these choices. And then the last piece in my cluster, which will be related to comments from my colleagues as well, relates to how we present SoTL gone public, if you will, or work that's gone public. Not only representing our work in essays and articles, but also a wider array of genres or formats, such as poetry, drama, videos, drawings, graphic short stories, role-playing, and more that we're not even thinking about right now. So this is the cluster of characteristics of SoTL in the arts and humanities that I'm drawn to, especially because of, to go back to the earlier slide, in my discipline, that central issue, central concern of representation. Who is represented? And so let me just advance this. And so to carry this cluster over to how we might support or advance equity in SoTL, from this cluster of characteristics, we then need to ask the question, in SoTL gone public, whose voices and whose experiences are represented and how? This brings up issues of multiplicity and representation, issues of fairness, and anti-oppressive practices, and more. So these are just some of the things that came up. So, an incomplete, but a start of a list is what I'll kind of run through with these bullets. So first of all, clearly this invokes the conversations and the whole movement of students as partners in SoTL. An equity approach drawn on the concerns in the left-hand column and this issue of representation is making sure that they are equally present as authors and presenters. So for instance, some years ago, earlier in the Students as Partners movement, albeit, I attended a session in which a whole group of people were presenting, and it was a faculty member who had partnered with 3 students, and the faculty member basically did most of the presentation, and then look to the students for, do you have anything to add? And that's an extreme example, but it's, I think it helps illuminate the idea of really being intentional about how the students are represented as presenters and as authors. Also related to that is on what basis is the order of names determined? I don't have a good answer for that right now, but the question must be raised. And I know others are writing and thinking about that issue of order of names. Also within Students as Partners, this issue of kind of rich with quotes and others' voices, are they writing and presenting using their own voices? In other words, we should be careful about too heavily editing or proofreading, if you will, the writing and presentation voice of Students as Partners. And then ultimately also, which students do we partner with? I think back to, I think it was just 2 days ago, but it feels like a while ago, in a session on relationality in SoTL, Peter Felton talked about the dangers of homophily, or the idea that birds of a feather flock together, that we're drawn to people similar to us. So who are we partnering with? This is part of how this cluster of characteristics can help advance an equity approach to SoTL. Next, beyond partners, Students as Partners, is the students at the center or the heart of the SoTL studies? There's kind of no good way to characterize or describe that. But the students who are in the SoTL studies, whose learning are we studying? Are we studying BIPOC students equally? Are we focusing on institutions that are majority white, like my current institution? Are we including historically Black colleges and universities and tribal colleges in the United States, for instance, and the equivalent kinds of institutions from around the world? Are we studying the learning of students who aren't, to use that, it's kind of awkward, but I think it's from psychology, the concept of weird students, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies? Are we reaching beyond that to represent learning outside of those typical practices? Are we including direct quotes from the students in our presentation and our publications? In other words, are we letting them speak for themselves, or are we aggregating and speaking for them? Or worse, briefly summarizing and erasing them? We value the direct quotes from students. Also, the issue of names. This is so fascinating. So an ethical approach to SoTL means that we anonymize the students. But I wonder what assumptions we're making about anonymity there. And I know this is a delicate issue, but it's worth thinking about. Do we name the students if they wish? I remember this may have been at the first ISSOTL conference. It was early on. Mary Elena Salvatore and Patricia Donahue talked about their conversations, if you will, with their publisher over using students' names in their wonderful book, The Elements and Pleasures of Difficulty. Of course, the publisher really pushed for anonymizing the students, but Salvatore and Donahue and the students who were involved in the SoTL project it was based on wanted their names included, of course with permission, but still it's worth thinking about. And then how do we describe the students at the center of SoTL studies? Do we represent them as full humans? Do we describe beyond how many and what kind of institution? Do we give them an identity beyond numbers in our study? And more questions like that. Similarly, or kind of taking a next leap in this thinking about how this cluster can help us think about equity in SoTL, thinking about literally underrepresented scholars. Are we auditing our bibliographies and reading lists to make sure that we're including and even foregrounding underrepresented scholars and their direct voices, their direct quotes, as we think about developing our SoTL knowledge? Are we reaching beyond just canonical SoTL? Are we also citing them, thinking about a recent project on citation practice in SoTL with Sophia Abbott, Lucy Mercer Mapstone, and Chris Estroden, and I in TLI, really thinking about who are we citing in SoTL and why? And then how are we attributing, so beyond just the parenthetical citation and the bibliography, in the text, how are we describing the knowledge, the way that we are thinking about these sources, these scholars? How are we describing who they are and even why we're citing them? Are we being transparent and explicit about this inclusion by, for instance, obviously using their full names, using all of their names rather than et al-ing authors, and acknowledging the origins of our knowledge, our thinking. And then finally in my cluster, thinking about genres and formats of SoTL gone public, if you will. And this picks up on Angela's cluster as well. Just the idea that public SoTL, in the sense of published, presented, discussed and talked about with colleagues and others, that we allow a more diverse way of showing how we represent ourselves and how we represent knowledge and knowledge making. So beyond pushing through the IMRAD format, the kind of traditional research report of introduction, methods, results, and discussion. So beyond thinking about allowing essays and valuing essays in formats other than that, are we also allowing non-traditional and multiple ways of representing knowledge, or ways of representing ways of knowing, if you will? Stories, oral recordings, the reflection that Angela talked about. And there's more I can say, but this is just a start in how this very small cluster of characteristics that we highly value within our disciplines might help us push SoTL to be more equity-minded. And with that, I will pass it off to a next cluster and discipline. Yeah, Dan.
Thanks, Nancy. And I actually want to start by going back to where Nancy started about the ways that our disciplines inform SoTL. And I want to start with a way that the Bergen meeting where this list came up really informed my understanding of my discipline, and then by extension, SoTL. And that's when Stephen Bloch-Schulman mentioned the idea of abductive reasoning, which Angela also mentioned earlier. And this was something that I had never heard of before, but really helped me understand the type of process that I had been doing in my own disciplinary work. And I'll confess that musicology as a discipline is very bad at exposing the methods that scholars use in their process. So to me, hearing this really helped me clarify what I was actually doing in my discipline, and then was able to bring that back to my teaching and my SoTL work. So what does abductive reasoning mean? And really it's this first bullet point of thinking about how we construct arguments rather than starting with a hypothesis. And more specifically, it's the idea of constructing arguments with the knowledge that our knowledge is incomplete. And this is true of me as a historian, that I know when I am in the archive, which is what I did for a lot of my dissertation, there's a lot missing. So I was forced to, construct a narrative based on the best guess that I had in my attempt to synthesize the information that I had and the information I had about what information I lacked. And what that means by extension is that I'm doing that with the knowledge that my conclusions are in a way temporary, that there always is the possibility of learning more that will either reinforce or potentially change, but perhaps radically, the types of conclusions I came up with. So that helped me first think about my discipline. And then I started to think, what does this mean for student learning? And this was at a time when I was also starting to explore the really rich scholarship about sort of grades and grading, and you know, the many arguments that grades and grading, you know, not only can be demotivating, but also maybe are not telling us precisely what we might assume they are telling us in terms of a measurement of student learning. So I was thinking, well, what does it mean to look abductively at student learning? And this led me to the rest of this cluster, which, as you'll see, aligns with many of the other clusters, and this concept aligns, I think, really well with really all of the ideas that we have and all the characteristics. So the first is engaging with nuance, right? And if we're looking for different types of evidence of student learning, we really need to look in a nuanced way, because, you know, going back to my previous discussion about my challenge with students entering with really disparate backgrounds, if I'm looking at learning, which I view as a change, I need to really look for the nuance of how a particular student really changed their way of thinking. I don't want to get stuck on the thing that they already knew when they entered the class. I want to find how they changed their way of thinking, knowing, or being in the world. And that requires that I engage with nuance as a way of collecting evidence. And then also attention to what as well as how meaning is articulated, right? And this gets, again, I'm sorry about that, at the same broad concept that I need to look at different ways for students to express their learning. So I can't just say, here, I'm going to give every student the same test, and that will tell me how every student has learned, because students have entered with different places. And also, you know, what's on that test and the format in which I'm asking questions on that test may favor or prioritize some types of expressions of learning and not others. And I'll say here, I got into faculty development initially through projects related to universal design. So this really resonated with me, the idea of really thinking about how are we constructing meaning from what's articulated, and how are students constructing meaning and communicating with us. So it's multiple ways. And this gets to the third or the fourth characteristic, which is being authentic or even poetic in ways of describing our methods. And I'll say I am not at all poetic in my approaches, but certainly I've appreciated seeing both my students, through sort of giving them flexibility in how they articulate their meaning, engage in poetry occasionally, but also in thinking about ways that others are able to articulate meaning and the evidence that they find in poetic and other types of ways. And this, I think, gets back to one of the principles from Peter Felton's work on the characteristic, on what defines excellent SoTL, in the idea of being methodologically sound. And to me, this one always challenged me initially. And when I started to think about methodology through this process of abduction, of looking at all of the information I can collect, and then trying to make the best guess in a way, and then articulate why I think that's what I'm seeing in my student learning, I think that really helped me understand how I could engage with SoTL in my classes. So if we go to the next slide, we talk about, you know, what does it look like to articulate what learning looks like? So when we're taking SoTL public, but also in looking at my students. So I view this as sort of two sides. One is, in my students' work, how can I tell if they're learning? And then how can I then translate that to others? And I have 4 bullet points here that sort of get at different ways I've been thinking about this. So one, this abductive reasoning. So this sort of overarching way of thinking about evidence. And then what that encouraged me to do was think about different ways I could collect evidence. And one practice I started around this time that really helped me do this and really focused on this type of reasoning is ungrading. And how I practice ungrading, it's through students reflecting on their work throughout the semester. And in those reflections, I asked them specifically, what are the things that you learned during the past few weeks? What are the challenges you encountered and how did you approach them? What are the goals that you set last time and how did you achieve or struggle to achieve those goals? And what goals do you have for next time. And in asking these reflective questions, and going back, Angela also talked about reflection, and Nancy, we've talked about reflection too. This allowed me to gain insight into the process of student learning. So this helped me overcome this equity gap in terms of what students bring into the class, because I'm having them articulate the process that they went through. And what's really surprising to me often is that where they highlight the challenges they experienced, it's not where I would have expected it. And sometimes this is because they did such a good job in the final product that I was assuming that that was the part they already knew and were comfortable with. So, sometimes it really gives me a great deal of insight into where they struggled and how they experienced challenges, and also where I can sort of nudge and push them going forward in the class. So I'll say then the other side to this, going with the sort of ways of describing methods and how we're articulating meaning, is I went to unessays as the main structure. And by unessays, what I mean is it's a practice where instead of defining, the structure of an assignment students are doing, it says, choose how you want to present information and try to do it effectively, essentially. And my students' work then is also all shared with each other as well as me. So it's not just sort of they're sharing something with me, they're sharing with each other and discussing it. So my students now some write papers still, some do PowerPoints, some do podcasts, some do videos. As I mentioned, I've had one or two create poems, and I had some do visual arts, and I always try to encourage them to add some type of explanation, not just for me, but for their peers, to understand their process more publicly. And this, again, has sort of given me insight into the learning process. It also allows me to challenge them in different ways. So this allows me to challenge them in terms of process. So to challenge them in terms of how they're thinking about what they're learning and what they're engaging with. And then lastly, I'll call back, Nancy already spoke about students as partners. To me, all of this allowed me to engage the students in my class as partners in understanding their learning process, because I'm really asking them through the ungrading process, tell me about your learning. And then I'm bringing that into dialogue with everything that I see to help develop my understanding, so that then I can go public and share with others what my students have learned as I understand it. And these reflections are sources for quotations, as was already discussed, as well as ways to help bridge these gaps of power in the classroom. So I will pass it on to John again.
I'm looking at the time and we're really tight. So what I'm going to do, if it's okay, I have a case study that I want to outline briefly. I'd like to give you the structure of it without the content in terms of disciplinary content. Does that sound okay, other panelists? Just because I want to save some time for discussion.
If you're comfortable with that, John, please do continue. We do also have some comments and questions already coming in through the chat, so we'll be able to jump in right away whenever you're all set.
Okay, I'll try to keep it brief so we can talk, but still do justice to the material. So I come from the discipline of religious studies. And as I talked about in the little intro, one of the challenges that I see is students coming with very different prior knowledge. Also, certain students having very personal connections to certain interpretations. Okay, so this is, SoTL comes in immediately for me when I was looking at my classroom and I'm noticing these things. So these are the what is descriptive type questions. As I try to just look around and say, this seems to be what's going on, and then how do I address it? Okay, and so what I want to outline just briefly is a case study that was an attempt to reflect on and then intervene and try to deal with some of these differences in my classroom. Along these lines, then I focused my comments on the promotion of equity through what students learn, okay, which I hope enables them to then better understand themselves through reflection and also be agents of equity and justice in other spheres of life. Okay, my case study then is, so I do religious texts, I do especially the New Testament texts. And so a quick case study on the Apostle Paul's discussion of governing authorities in his letter to the Romans in chapter 13. Okay. Paul says a number of things in this. These are things like let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed. One must be subject to the authorities not only because of their ability to inflict wrath on you, but also because of your own conscience. Things like this. Okay. My intervention here is to approach the study of an ancient authoritative religious text through historical case studies. Okay. The two case studies I'm going to illustrate are from the 16th century, King James, who wrote this short thing called On the Divine Right of Kings, where Romans 13 is used to defend kings as the ultimate unquestionable authority, and a present-day conservative American theologian who argues that for limited government. Okay. I provide students text to read for both of these, and then I ask them to reflect on how they emphasize different parts of the text for different for their different arguments. Okay. It's an interesting example, I think, because the American example, the present-day example, takes place in an American context where, which was founded explicitly on the rejection of the idea of the divine right of kings. Okay, I provide context and things like this for this in the course. In the class period, we discuss the different contexts for these and why these made sense, what kind of issues they were responding to, and then I have students do an imaginative exercise where they try to imagine some other historical situation where somebody situated reads Paul's texts and appropriates it for their own situation. So it tries to get them to do the same thing that King James is doing or theologians are doing in 21st century America or everywhere else. Okay. The idea then is that a lot of the same descriptive or explanatory subtle questions that I'm asking of my students, the students are also asking of the text. Okay, and after that, we then read a piece where someone tries to root Paul's text in a first century context of Roman imperial context, and intentionally reacts against modern appropriations and historical appropriations. Okay. This allows students to consider what it could have meant in Paul's context. We also consider how the scholar who's making this historical argument is himself engaged in a form of argument in current political contexts. So some of that sort of stuff. So the idea then is to be able to sympathize, but also situate different interpretations of a text to understand the text. At the end of the semester, we've done a semester of these sorts of activities. I then ask students to do another reflective essay where they do the same, where they expand their understanding of texts. Not just Paul, not just King James, but themselves, but also wherever they're going for winter break. And the idea here is to allow them to see other areas of their life, their own situatedness, the different contexts they're part of, as texts that they can first sympathize with, try to map out and make sense of as they're engaging difference. Okay, I see this as interacting with students from these two different prior knowledge backgrounds that we're talking about by helping students with no knowledge of these texts see how they've shaped different cultures, and for students with a lot of experience with these texts and maybe a very specific interpretation to see how different contexts could create different interpretations. And then to make these cognitive moves transferable to other parts of their life. Okay. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there just because we have 5 minutes. I hope that was fair, but it was a little bit shortened just because of our time. So maybe we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, John, and apologies for the shortness of time as we came to you there. Maybe we could advance to the next slide here, just to gloss really briefly what we hope are some key takeaways from these conversations. In the left-hand column there, we see that we've sort of categorized different areas where we can be thinking specifically about drafting an equity-minded approach to SoTL through these characteristics, thinking about the purpose of SoTL, the role of students who are studied, who are partnered with, what student learning can or is expected to look like, thinking about methodology, data and evidence, how voices are produced and reproduced through literature reviews, and then finally those written forms, those final products of how that SoTL generated knowledge is represented. And so finally, yes, in our last few minutes, I hope we can open it up for some discussion here. There are some threads of conversation already begun in the chat, but I hope especially too that we might be able to draw in John's perspective, his insights here coming from religious studies and thinking through those case studies and thinking about promoting equity out in the world in and through SoTL as well. So with that, opening it up, if folks would like to unmute and share, or also we can keep it going in the chat here. Katerina, I see that you have your camera on. I don't know if that was, maybe you're hoping to pick up on some of what you've mentioned in the chat already. If so, please go ahead.
I was mainly just making myself visible to you if possible, because I think it's easier to have a conversation if you see each other, but it's not very easy anyways here. I've written some comments in the margins, but I feel that they're maybe sort of peripheral to what you're actually talking about and also quite contextual. So it's something that I need to get my head around this because I don't really recognize it from my own context. So if someone else has a comment or a question, I'll leave the floor to someone else.
Thank you, Katerina. I just wanted to give a moment of silence to see if anyone wanted to pop in and respond there. So again, just drawing everyone's attention to the chat where there's some kind of back and forth going based on, Katerina, your first contribution there, where you ask, is your perception and or experience that SoTL generally is not characterized by what you described? In my experience working with faculty members starting to engage in SoTL, many of them claim that the educational literature they read as prep is too anecdotal, reflective, essay stylish, etc. So they ask for more quantitative or positivistic research. And she's suggesting that, like, yes, like these, like, absolutely, if there is that kind of anecdotal, essayistic kind of work in education literature that is perhaps in a negative, kind of pejorative way described as not rigorous or not really SoTL, and the conversation kind of continues from there. So I don't want to just read the whole chat transcript to everyone, but I'll invite, you know.
Well, I have a question then that I would like to pose to all of you. So I'm thinking, obviously there are different epistemological beliefs coming from our own disciplinary glasses, you might say, but is the push that you experience against these ways of doing SoTL and the values that you've highlighted in your presentation, is the opposition, if I may use that word, is that targeted towards SoTL in the arts and humanities and from the arts and humanities, or is it targeted towards research generally in arts and humanities?
And I see, Nancy, you have your hand raised and are responding in the chat, so go ahead.
Well, I know we're out of time, but I just want to draw it back to our topic, our kind of overarching equity. I think the key takeaway is then how might an equity-minded SoTL, as we've described it here, which is a beginning, be encountered, be critiqued, be accepted or not, if it has these characteristics. I think that's something for us to chew on. Yeah.
Happy to chew.
I hate to interrupt great conversations, but I have the moderator role of saying we're out of time, and unfortunately, I need to hit close on the session for the recording. But thank you very much to the panelists, to the group for the other group. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. We'll talk very soon.